I'm Jim.
And I'm Garrett.
And this is
Jim and Garrett at the movies.
Holy shit, we're in the same location.
How did you get here?
How did you get here?
I got here the same way you got here, in the front door.
Oh my god, and I had to come on a plane.
So this is a strange thing, because normally we are thousands of miles apart, but this being the holiday season, old friends that we are, we've managed to come together to celebrate the New Year's and to do a review of some movies we saw.
Exactly. We actually went to right. It's good that you end exactly when I take a drink. You should get a job in the waiter service industry. So how was everything just as you take a bite? And we actually saw this movie together, which was the first for Jim and Garrett at the movies.
And the first in a long time.
All right, exactly. So what are we reviewing?
We are reviewing Vice.
Vice is, okay, so this is directed by Adam McKay, written and directed by Adam McKay. It is about the vice presidency of Dick Cheney, played by Christian Bale, co-starring Amy Adams and Steve Carell. This is similar in style to The Big Short, Adam McKay's previous film, which also garnered some awards buzz. And Vice is equally garnering awards buzz with multiple Golden Globe nominations. Garrett, we saw this film. What did you think of this movie?
One definitely cannot deny Adam McKay's style. He takes incredibly technical, convoluted stories, which are not very cinematic in their nature, and somehow manages to make films out of them, which, if nothing else, is a remarkably impressive feat.
Mm-hmm.
Collaborating on those impressive feats, the acting and in particular the makeup and costuming and body transformation of Christian Bale as Dick Cheney was just astonishing. I mean, there were several times in which I honestly forgot that I was watching an actor playing a role, and I sincerely thought we were looking at the former Vice President of the United States.
Wow.
It was a chameleonic transformation. It was absolutely amazing.
Chameleonic.
Chameleonic. Coining a word if it's not already one.
No, I think it has to be a word.
Should be.
Okay. Also, Amy Adams was fantastic.
Yes, and I think perhaps some long overdue Oscar attention for her.
Well, yeah, we'll see. She's got quite a bit of competition. I think overall this film was everything you said. I agree with. I like Adam McKay's style. I like Christian Bale. I like the movie. I think the film is well written, well acted. It's a basically good movie. What I had issues with was the film kind of bites off more than I think it can chew. This is similar to another film that we probably won't review on this podcast, but Mary Queen of Scots tries to condense like 40 years of history into 2 hours, and likewise Vice is trying to condense 40 years of history into 2 hours.
I think it's actually 60.
Well, I believe it's 60. What's 20 years here and there? 60 years of history in 2 hours, and sometimes that gets a little unwieldy for the film. Nonetheless, I also wanted a more clear point of view. It seemed as though this was simply saying Dick Cheney was a heartless son of a bitch, and that's all we have to say about that. And I don't know, maybe I wonder if there's a little more that could have been said there. That, of course, Dick Cheney was a heartless son of a bitch, so I get the idea. Was, ever shall be.
Mm-hmm.
So what did you think about the film?
Never in our hearts.
Yeah.
Literally. I agree that some of the cuts were jarring. It often felt like it was sort of rushing to try to get to the next sort of milestone. Everyone remembers the time Dick Cheney shot the guy in the face. We got to include that somewhere.
Right.
And it sort of felt like it was in some ways tripping over itself. At the same time, I think the film was sort of aware of its own sort of shortcomings, and many times would hang a lantern on it and make deliberate in-jokes, which I don't want to spoil here because our reviews are always spoiler-free.
Yeah.
But definitely the kind of thing that you don't typically see in a movie, much less in a biopic, where they make meta jokes about the nature of filmmaking and possible alternative futures and so forth.
And the nature of biopics as a whole.
Indeed.
Yeah, some of those jokes really landed for me, and I really like some of those. I also, one other criticisms of the film before we sort of go to our overall, like some of the images and some of the visual metaphors were a little too on the nose for me. They worked, and I thought they were very clever, But after a few moments of going, yeah, I get it. It's too on the nose.
I
Did you find that as well?
I see what you mean. I definitely can identify some, even without you mentioning the specifics. But it didn't really
Right.
bother me. It seemed to me that the film, you simplify the moral of the story as Dick Cheney's a heartless son of a bitch. But frankly, I think that as the film announces in the beginning, even though this was not that long ago, a lot of people have sort of forgotten about it and been distracted by recent events to the point where
Sure.
they forget the role they played. So simply underscoring those points and reminding people, yes, this man was once one of the most powerful human beings and an incredibly dangerous human being, not to be forgotten.
Sure. Yeah, that's true. It does kind of harken back to um similarly dark times. I was gonna say darker times, yet I,
The late unpleasantness.
as isn't everything the late unpleasantness these days?
Now, I mean, along those same lines, though, I have read some criticisms which I can't necessarily vouch for, but certainly seemed informed that the movie gets Dick Cheney's political philosophy wrong. They portray him basically as an opportunistic nihilist who doesn't really believe in anything. And many people who were paying probably closer attention than I was, and I felt like I was paying pretty close attention back in
Yeah.
those days, say that that's simply not true. That Dick Cheney was a neocon to the core. That he was ultra hawk, and he believed in using military power to spread both the American model of government, but also to enforce a totalitarian American rule on other parts of the world.
So what you're saying is that some people argue that Dick Cheney was a nihilist, and other people argue that Dick Cheney was a hawkish colonialist son of a bitch. And so, so basically, you've got a nihilist in one hand and a hawkish son of a bitch in the other.
Brothers and sisters come together. Can't we just once recognize Dick Cheney was a nihilistic
And
colonialist son of a bitch?
Right there, you go. I mean, yeah, it seems like there's not too much of a space in between those things. Nevertheless, I think all of these biopics have a point of view. Like they're trying to present either a thesis about the person or about the time or about the time in which the film is being received. So it's either about the Bush era, a thesis about Dick Cheney himself, or a thesis about today. I don't see a thesis about. I see theses about each of those things, but none of them really fully explored within the context of the film.
And along the same lines, biopics traditionally, even of terrible people,
Mm-hmm.
often have an obligation to humanize their subjects simply in virtue of the fact that no matter how awful they may be, they are still human. And the closest they came to that was showing his relationship with his wife and then his relationship with his daughters, which, while certainly humanistic and touching at times, ultimately by the end of the film kind of collapsed not just
Yeah.
into the background but simply failed to do what I was appreciating it doing for the most part, which is giving me something about Dick Cheney that was recognizably human. And by the end, that was kind of gone,
It
and
was
I felt that I mean, even though that may have been narratively,
appropriate.
satisfying
Yeah.
and historically accurate, ultimately sort of undermined an important function of biopics to show that their subjects are human, all too human.
Sure. Yeah. 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 So what do you give this film out of 5 stars?
On a 5-star rating, I would give it a 3.5.
That's exactly mine as well. So we're both recommending the film.
Yes, yes.
It is an interesting film to take a look at, but it's not without a few issues. So let's move on to our movie club.
Movie club.
Movie club. Oh my god. It is yeah, right. Wag the Dog is our movie club entry today. We were originally going to do a full podcast just on Wag the Dog, so we would sort of suss out some of the Wag the Dog elements of our current political climate. Instead, we're sort of pairing it with Vice, which I think it's a logical pairing. Wag the Dog, for those of you who don't know, is a 1997 film. It is directed by Barry Levinson. It was written by David Mamet and Hilary Hankin, although David Mamet's dialogue is all over this film. Stars Dustin Hoffman, Robert De Niro, Anne Heche, Dennis Leary, Woody Harrelson, and everybody else, Willie Nelson, everybody else who was an actor during the 90s. It is about a Washington spin doctor who manufactures a war with the help of a Hollywood movie producer in order to distract the public's attention away from a presidential sex scandal in the run up to an election. So I this is one of my favorite films of all time, perhaps my favorite comedy. What did you think of Wag the Dog? What are some things that you want to talk about vis-a-vis Vice, vis-a-vis Trump, vis-a-vis the world?
Well, I want to start by talking much about the film qua the
Yeah,
film.
yeah.
Like many of our movie clubs that we're going over, I'm finding I have a very different take on it in the current era than I did in the past era.
Hmm.
When this film first came out, I enjoyed it, but also was frustrated by it in many ways. Boiling it down to its most simplistic point, it was pretty clearly satirizing specifically the attempt of Bill Clinton to distract from his sexual escapades by focusing on military matters in the Middle East.
It's aiming much higher than that, I
But
think.
that I think was definitely the touchstone at the time,
Hmm.
and I think that historically speaking, that's just wrong. Bill Clinton, I mean, he may have been trying to distract from this, but he sure as hell wasn't manufacturing a bullshit scandal to try to distract. He was literally going after Osama bin Laden and arguably didn't get him precisely because the Republicans insisted that he was trying to distract from his sex scandals. Now, obviously, no one can know how things would have played out had they not been, and I don't want to give Bill Clinton too much credit. Obviously,
Right.
the guy deserves a large amount of criticism, both for his military endeavors and for the sex scandal. But I find it incredibly hypocritical for that many Republicans raked him over the coals for trying to distract from his sex scandals with the military scandal, and then blamed him for not getting Osama bin Laden after 9/11. So that left a bit of a bitter taste in my mouth about Wag the Dog because I felt it was playing into that narrative.
Hmm.
That having been said, of course, the film is incredibly well written, funny as hell, clever, um, uh, uh, sharply directed, structured in a beautiful way. It's definitely got a lot of strengths there. Like I say, having come back and revisited it, like you say, I see it now as aiming beyond that, and
Right.
in many ways, I think was much more prophetic than it was. Jean Baudrillard, the French philosopher, famously once said that the Gulf War never actually happened. That what he meant by that was kind of a confusing thing. Was that what we think of when we think of the Gulf War is the media production of it. He wasn't denying that troops were sent into the Middle East, into Iraq, and so forth. That obviously happened, but that is not the reality. Or that reality is completely detached from what Americans and the world at large think of when they think of the war in the Persian Gulf.
Sure.
That what they think of is a thing that never happened precisely because it was staged.
It was
Now,
a theatrical
exactly.
production.
Now,
Right?
I'm not
According to that philosopher.
exactly, and I'm not sure if Mamet and the other filmmakers had Baudrillard in mind when they were making this film, but it's definitely an exemplification of his thesis and sort of taken it to the next level.
Hmm.
And now that we've moved, past the Clinton era and then into the Bush era, and then arguably at least some in the Obama era, but on steroids into the Trump era,
Right.
an era of complete and total unreality. Where the reality-based community, the famous phrase from I believe it was Karl Rove, I think you used that phrase.
Hmm.
This is a film that sort of shows the behind the scenes of the non-reality based community trying to manipulate people who were doing their best to stay hinged on reality itself.
Sure.
And the reality based community fails, and the production succeeds.
Can you explain the reality? Can you sort of suss out what you mean by that? By
Yeah.
some of those things?
So again,
I think you're using some terms that I like you to sort of.
So it was according to an interview, which was never officially confirmed to be with Karl Rove, but everyone speculates. It was an unnamed source in the Bush administration. The source was criticizing the reporter in question, whose name I can't remember, as thinking that a reality that politics should be governed by reality, by actual events.
Hmm. So the reporter was saying, I think you should govern based upon reality.
Yes.
And the unnamed source said
that's naive, and that he said, I think a direct quote: "We are history's actors. We make our own reality." So while you guys, the press, and the reality-based communities, try to study one reality, we're going out, we're making a different reality.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you want to interpret that charitably, what that means is this sort of Nietzschean will to power, where we're going to make the world the way we want it to be. If you want to interpret it uncharitably, it's like in Wag the Dog, making a complete fabrication that isn't at all real and selling it to the people as if it is real.
Right.
Which is obviously much more horrifying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that Wag the Dog sort of prepared me for watching the Trump campaign as it rose to power, because I think I was sort of prepared to sort of look at politics as an entertainment rather than as a real business where people's lives are at stake, and that that's terrifying.
And I
Yeah.
think in some ways, I mean, I think it's a fair criticism of the movie that rather than sort of, empowering a way to fight back against this,
Mhm.
it's basically telling its audience that it has to be resigned to this. That there is no way in which we, as American citizens, can ever get behind this veil. That the powers that be are simply too good, too omniscient, and even something like an adversarial party system is unable ultimately to tear down the deceptions and lies of the other party. And ergo, there simply is no getting back to the reality-based community. All we have is the simulacra.
So, what do you think about this scene? That I probably the most interesting scene in the film for me, as I'm sort of wrestling with these questions, and it's a scene that by all accounts actually shouldn't be in the movie because it distracts from the central narrative. But it's the scene when they talk about voting, and each of the it's Dustin Hoffman's character, Dennis Leary's character, one of the other advertising execs, I think her name's Andrea Mitchell's character. I could be mistaken about that. All talk about whether or not they vote. And Dennis Leary's character said, I don't vote. It's meaningless because I voted for Boo Powell to get in at first base in the All-Star game. He didn't get in, and it soured me on the whole thing. Another one was like, I don't vote in cramped spaces. And so they all have these silly reasons for voting, and yet these are or for not voting rather. Yet these are the people who are behind the scenes in control of our political discourses.
Right. They're not participating in the political process the way the rest of us plebeians are supposed to, but they're nonetheless wielding tremendously much more power than we are.
Right.
And like a lot of Dennis Leary's I kind of suspect that he was just on set being Dennis Leary and said something good, and they decided to fold it into the script.
I don't know. That sounds really Mamet-y to me. Like I could imagine Mamet going, "I voted for Boo Powell at first base."
And now that you mention it, I kind of wonder if maybe there shouldn't be more collaborations between Dennis Leary and Mamet. That sort of seems like it would be a natural pairing.
Although Mamet has gone through a political conversion since Wag the Dog,
right?
One that, yeah, well, he's gone through. We'll just leave it at that.
We'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and you can watch his appearance on Ben Shapiro's show if you really are interested. Anyway, yeah, I what else did I want to say about this film? The dialogue, it just sings.
Oh yeah,
like this is I mean the Robert De Niro to William H. Macy's speech. That's
classic.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably one of my favorite comedies. It is one of my favorite comedies, I should say. So what would you do? Any other Trumpian things that you want to talk about this?
Yeah, well, I mean, first off, to build on that dialogue point quickly. Yeah, you can. There's a lot of fair criticisms that you can say about Mamet. He's got a lot of misogyny in a lot of his works. Again, you mentioned his recent sort of political transformations, which many people find off-putting. And from all reports, he can be a bit of a jerk in a lot of ways. But it really can't be denied that he's one of the best writers of dialogue that in 20th 21st century cinema.
Sure.
I'd put him up there with Aaron Sorkin and Quentin Tarantino. Just some of the best. Again, I'm not realistic by any stretch of the imagination, but some of the most poetic, sharpest, most memorable, biting, insightful. And it's the kind of thing which you could say, if you want to write dialogue, study Mamet, study Tarantino, but at the same time, you read that and you read that stuff, you almost have to realize there's no way you can possibly approach that sort of. It becomes in some ways kind of just too daunting and too intimidating because he's that good.
Right. I mean, he writes, his dialogue is poetry. And yeah, all of the criticisms you said about him are certainly fair, but he deserves his lauds as well. What any other comments about the movie as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, you mentioned we subtitled this in the age of Trump, and that's sort of in subtext. Now let's make it the explicit text.
Let's do.
I do wonder what it would be like to sit down and watch this film with a team of Trump supporters, because I'm predicting. Obviously, I haven't done this, but I'm going to make a prediction. That they would see the film, love it, love the message, love the moral of the story, and then turn around and say, that is exactly why we need Donald Trump.
Right.
Because he doesn't do that. He cuts through the bullshit. He refuses to let the politics is normal, which is exemplified in the film, play out, and he disrupts the apple cart, and no one else knows how to deal with them. I'm not sure how I would respond in an in-person setting to someone who made uh, that interpretation of the film with respect to our current political climate.
Well, I mean, when Trump says that the system is rigged, it's all rigged, you know, of course it's rigged in his favor. Like that's the part about it that he doesn't talk about. But I when he said that, I thought about Wag the Dog, about how in a Gramscian sense, how our media sort of pushes us toward a dominant narrative, and that dominant narrative always supports the elite, always supports the upper echelon. How I mean, even our films, which we sometimes try and suss out on this podcast, even our films are leading toward this idea of a benign elitism, and I think this film. So when Trump talks about this, how the system is rigged, I think about how Wag the Dog sort of demonstrates its riggedness.
And I think in some ways, we really could use not necessarily like a reboot or an update of the film, but an equivalent of the film today, because
Yeah,
in the context of the film itself, all these machinations are being employed to protect one particular politician of one particular party from an election assault by the other party, which
right.
obviously is important and significant, but quite frankly, in the context of the current politics, seems perhaps a little bit quaint.
Oh, Wag the Dog seems quaint,
Yeah,
according to yeah.
because I mean, again, I'm not necessarily fully endorsing this read on the current politics. Obviously, there's lots of different ways to read it. It's complicated. I don't mean to
Sure.
oversimplify it, but many people have given the interpretation, and I think it's a reasonable interpretation, that Trump is using the sorts of media and manipulative psychological techniques that are exemplified in Wag the Dog, not simply to embolden one party against another, or even simply to empower one president against opposition, but rather to attack the fundamental nature of liberal democracy itself.
Hmm.
I mean, underneath Wag the Dog is still the idea that the democratic process is sacrosanct.
Really?
There's never any sense that they're going to do anything to undermine the legitimacy of the vote or to use military power to overthrow
Okay.
civilian elected government or anything like that. There's, I think, a good argument to be made, and again, it's only hinted at here and there, but it's definitely there, that Donald Trump would not accept and would encourage his followers not to accept a genuine, legitimate democratic loss.
Yeah, but there's still I mean, whether or not that's true or not,
Right.
let our bleak future decide. But I'm interested in, do you think Wag the Dog supports a democratic conception of the world? And not in terms of right and left, but a democracy. Do you think Wag the Dog supports that? Because I think this is a warning against the destruction of democracy at the hands of the media and at the hands of skilled public relations manipulators.
Yeah, I would call it more a hollowing out of democracy while
Mm.
leaving the structures of democracy intact.
Yeah, that's
And obviously that's scary and something that shouldn't be embraced or encouraged. The lessons should be learned, but nothing in the film ever hints at overthrowing democratically elected
sure.
government or
That's
refusing to acknowledge democratic results from the
true.
election.
Just manipulate the fuck out of everybody.
Exactly. Yeah. Puppet master people within the confines of an established democratic system. And again, on this more cynical interpretation of our current times, the current regime is going further than that and deliberately attacking democratic norms and refusing to accept it using the same techniques. So that's why I say again, a revisitation of this film or something like this film, where it's not one president against a opposition party, but rather one president against the norms of democracy itself, against the constitutional idea that people should be allowed to have say in who controls and who's in charge, and instead it be this man wants to be in power no matter what. For lack of a better term, a fascist dictatorship.
Sure.
Now there have obviously been many movies which have explored fascism, but nothing that's done it, I think, in the sort of satirical, cheeky in the context of United States going in that direction way.
Yeah.
And for that, well, we need Dave Mamet to come back to the side of the
good. Yeah. Judging by the last interview I saw and read of him, he's not going to come back left. If anything, he's going to go a little further right, but so be it.
So be it.
So what do you think about the give the film an overall rating? Let's
Like I
go
say,
there.
as often has is the case, my original rating and my current rating are quite different. My
Mhm.
original rating would probably be about a 3 out of 5.
Uh-huh.
Strong, funny, but also, like I say, left a pretty bad sour taste in my mouth. And I also felt it had some sort of structural issues. I felt there was a lag in the third act.
The Woody
Yeah,
Harrelson
the Woody
bit.
Harrelson time length that was it didn't quite fit the rest of the film the way it should have. But now, again, in the context of where, like I say, I think the film was very, very prophetic, eerily so, and the film gets a lot of extra bonus points, I think, for anticipating where we ended up in ways that were, eerie.
We're still recovering
Yeah,
from.
yeah,
Yeah,
and
right.
still going through. So yeah,
Yeah.
now I bump it up to 4.5.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm 5. I mean, I've always been 5 though, so this has always been one of my favorite films. But all right, so what are we? I have no idea what we're doing
Yeah,
next.
yeah, we need to think that
But
through.
we're gonna talk about it, and I'm gonna go back to the other side of the screen so that we're no longer sitting next to each other. And we'll be back when we're back. And we wish all of you a happy new year. See a lot of good movies this year, and we will help you make decisions about what to go to in the theaters in the coming year. So my name is Jim,
And I'm Garrett.
and this has been
Jim and Garrett at the movies.